You've been told that Navy SEALs are the ultimate warriors, the apex predators of modern warfare. The men who killed bin Laden, who operate in the darkest corners of the world, who set the gold standard for special operations. And you know what? They are. But there's a story the History Channel won't tell you. A story about the day those legendary warriors walked into a jungle training exercise in 1969 and met a group of Australians who made them question everything they thought they knew about combat. 47 Navy SEALs entered that joint operation in the Rung Special Zone. All 47 walked out, but only 19 of them would volunteer for a second rotation with the Australian SAS. The other 28 requested immediate reassignment, not because they were afraid of the enemy, because they were disturbed by their allies. One SEAL lieutenant submitted a 2-page report that got immediately classified. The opening line read, "We thought they were joking when they said they'd been in position for 6 days. Then we found the evidence. These men operate on a different level of existence." What happened during Operation Crimson Tide when SEALs watched Australians do something with enemy bodies that made hardened commandos physically ill? Why did a SEAL Team 2 operator break down in tears and refuse to go back on patrol, saying, "I can't become what they are"? How did a 4-man Australian patrol teach the world's most elite maritime commandos that everything they knew about jungle warfare was wrong? And what was the incident in the tunnels of Ku Kai that forced the Pentagon to issue a classified directive stating, "American personnel will not attempt to replicate Australian underground clearance techniques under any circumstances"? You need to watch every second of this documentary because we're about to expose the clash of philosophies that the military tried to bury. We're revealing the psychological warfare tactic that made SEALs uncomfortable. We're showing you the training exercise that turned into a blood-chilling demonstration. And we're giving you the classified after-action reports that prove even America's best had something to learn from men who hunted humans like animals. The SEALs brought precision, technology, and aggressive violence of action. The Australians brought patience, fieldcraft, and something darker. Something that made the SEALs realize that being good at killing isn't the same as being comfortable with it. This is the story of mutual respect earned through shock, admiration mixed with horror, and lessons that changed American special operations forever. This is the story of what happens when 2 apex predators meet in the jungle, and one of them realizes he's been hunting in the kiddie pool. Are you ready to see what made the SEALs say, "We thought they were joking"? Let's go. Rung Special Zone, South Vietnam, October 3, 1969, 0:30. The darkness was absolute, the kind of black that erases depth perception and turns the world into a suffocating void. Lieutenant Marcus Webb of SEAL Team 2 had operated in this hellish mangrove swamp a dozen times over his 8-month deployment. He knew the smell of the rotting vegetation, the sound of water moving through channels, the way mud tried to suck boots off with every step. He was good at this. His team was good at this. They were SEALs after all, the best maritime special operators on the planet, but tonight was different. Tonight they were operating with the Australians. And from the moment Webb met them at the briefing, something felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong, just wrong. The Australian patrol leader, a sergeant they called Scarecrow because of his gaunt frame, had explained the mission in a flat, emotionless monotone. They would insert via small boat, move 3 kilometers inland through the swamp, establish observation on a suspected Viet Cong supply route, gather intelligence for 72 hours, and extract. Standard reconnaissance patrol. Webb had done 100 of them. What bothered Webb was how the Australians prepared. The SEALs loaded their Stoner 63 light machine guns, M16s with M203 grenade launchers, fragmentation grenades, smoke grenades, and enough ammunition to fight their way out of hell twice. Each SEAL carried approximately 80 pounds of gear. They were a walking arsenal, ready for violence at any moment. The Australians carried almost nothing. Each man had a single rifle, maybe 200 rounds of ammunition, a canteen, and a small pack that looked half empty. No grenades visible, no heavy weapons, no radio antennas. Webb watched as Scarecrow pulled items from his pack and left them on the dock. First aid kit reduced to bare minimum, rations cut in half, spare socks discarded entirely. Webb approached him, genuinely concerned. "Scarecrow, you need more ammo, mate. 3 days in the bush, you might hit contact." Scarecrow looked at Webb with eyes that seemed to focus on something 1,000 yards away. "If I fire 200 rounds on this patrol, I've already failed. We're not here to fight, we're here to watch." Webb laughed. He actually laughed. "Right, watch." "Okay, what happens when Charlie finds you?" Scarecrow didn't smile. "He won't find us, and if he does, we'll know about it long before he does. Then we'll decide if he lives or dies." "But he won't find us." Webb thought it was bravado. Tough guy talk from a lean operator trying to impress the SEALs. This was going to be an educational experience, just not the way Webb expected. The insertion went smoothly. 2 Zodiac boats, blacked out, engines muffled, slipped into the mangrove channels at 0200 hours. The SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, weapons at ready, spacing perfect, scanning sectors with night vision. They were a coordinated machine. The Australians moved differently. They didn't scan with heads on a swivel. They moved slowly, almost lazily, as if taking a stroll through a park. But Webb noticed something odd. Every few steps, Scarecrow would stop completely. Not crouch, not take a knee, just stop. He would stand there for 30 seconds, sometimes a full minute, then continue moving. Webb had no idea what he was doing. After 400 meters, Webb keyed his radio to check in with his team. The click of the handset seemed thunderous. Scarecrow turned, moved back to Webb with movements that made no sound, and put his hand over the radio. He didn't speak. He just shook his head slowly, then pointed at the radio, then made a slashing motion across his throat. No radio. Scarecrow pulled out a waterproof notepad and wrote in tiny letters, "Radio only for emergency extraction. Sound travels 800 meters in this terrain. Every transmission tells them exactly where we are." Webb wanted to argue. SEALs used encrypted radios, but something about the way Scarecrow looked at him made Webb shut his mouth and nod. 3 hours into the movement, Webb started to understand he had been catastrophically wrong about these men. They had covered barely 2 kilometers, but it wasn't about speed. Every single step the Australians took was deliberate, calculated. They would place the outside edge of their boot down first, roll the weight inward, feel for sticks, then commit to the step. It took 3 to 4 seconds per step. At that pace, they moved maybe 100 meters per hour. Webb's team was getting frustrated. One of his SEALs, Rodriguez, keyed his radio to complain. Webb shot him a look and Rodriguez backed off, but the frustration was visible. They were operators, not statues. This glacial pace felt wrong, inefficient, cowardly even. Then just before dawn, everything changed. Scarecrow froze, not the normal stop-and-listen freeze. His entire body went rigid, 1 foot still in the air mid-step. He held that position, balanced on one leg like a heron for over 2 minutes. Webb watched, mesmerized, as Scarecrow slowly, incrementally slowly, lowered his raised foot without making contact. He shifted his weight backward, reversed his last step, and signaled the patrol to halt and go prone. Webb dropped. They lay in the mud, mosquitoes immediately swarming. They waited. 5 minutes. 10, 20. Webb had no idea what they were waiting for. He could hear nothing except normal swamp sounds. Then he heard it, faint. So faint he almost missed it. The sound of wood knocking against wood. Then voices speaking in low Vietnamese. Webb's heart rate spiked. The enemy was close, very close. 20 meters away, barely visible in the gray light of approaching dawn, a sampan moved through the channel. 4 Viet Cong soldiers, weapons slung, relaxed, talking among themselves. They passed within spitting distance of the patrol's position. The SEALs didn't breathe. The Australians didn't exist. They had become part of the swamp. The sampan continued on, voices fading. After 10 more minutes of absolute stillness, Scarecrow slowly raised his head and signaled to continue. When they stopped for a security halt an hour later, Webb crawled over to Scarecrow. "How did you know they were coming? I didn't hear anything." Scarecrow looked at him with those 1,000-yard eyes. "The birds stopped singing 400 meters east, then 300 meters. Then 200. Something was moving toward us, disturbing the canopy. The sampan was the only thing that made sense. I didn't know for certain until I heard the wood. But the jungle told me they were coming 5 minutes before they arrived." Webb stared at him. "The birds, the fucking birds." Webb had been listening to birds his entire patrol and never once thought about what their behavior meant. He had been trained to listen for enemy movement, for weapons, for voices. He had never been trained to listen to the jungle itself. And in that moment, Lieutenant Marcus Webb realized he didn't actually know how to operate in the jungle. He knew how to fight in it. But he didn't know how to become part of it. They reached the observation point at 1000 hours, 8 hours after insertion for a 3-kilometer movement. By SEAL standards, it was embarrassingly slow. By Australian standards, it was exactly right. The position overlooked a trail intersection, where intelligence suggested the Viet Cong moved supplies every 3 to 4 days. The mission was simple. Observe, record, photograph if possible, gather intelligence. Do not engage unless compromised. Standard reconnaissance doctrine for both units. The Australians immediately began doing something that made Webb's jaw drop. They didn't dig fighting positions. They didn't establish fields of fire. They didn't set up a security perimeter with overlapping sectors. Instead, they arranged themselves in the existing vegetation in a pattern that made them completely invisible. One man positioned himself inside a hollow log. Another lay beneath the exposed root system of a mangrove tree, his body contorted to fit the natural space. Scarecrow lay in a shallow depression filled with leaf litter, and over the course of 20 minutes, he buried himself using only his hands, pulling debris over his body until only his eyes and the barrel of his rifle were visible. The 4th Australian, a man they called Dingo, did something that disturbed Webb on a visceral level. He stripped down to his underwear, covered his entire body in mud from the swamp, and then put his uniform back on over the mud. The stench was immediate and overpowering, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. Webb's SEAL corpsman actually gagged. Dingo saw the reaction and spoke for the first time since insertion, his voice barely a whisper. "Smell is the first sense. Humans smell like humans. Soap, deodorant, toothpaste, gun oil, clean fabric. The enemy can smell you from 100 meters if the wind is right. If I smell like the swamp, I'm invisible." He smiled, showing teeth that hadn't been brushed in days. "Welcome to the real jungle, mate." The SEALs set up their position with professional competence. They established good concealment, interlocking fields of fire, and maintained security in shifts. It was textbook special operations. But watching the Australians, Webb started to feel like he was watching a different species operate. These men weren't setting up a military position. They were disappearing. Within 30 minutes, Webb couldn't locate 3 of the 4 Australians, even though he knew exactly where they were. They had become ghosts. The first 24 hours passed in relative silence. The SEALs rotated security, ate their rations, maintained their weapons, whispered quietly when necessary. Professional, disciplined, good soldiers doing a good job, The Australians did not move. Webb watched Scarecrow's position for 11 straight hours and never saw him shift his weight, adjust his rifle, or even appear to breathe. At one point, Webb became convinced the man had died. He signaled Rodriguez to crawl over and check. Rodriguez moved carefully, using proper low-crawl technique, taking 20 minutes to cover 15 meters. When he reached Scarecrow's position and was about to tap him on the shoulder, Scarecrow's hand shot out and grabbed Rodriguez's wrist with a grip like iron. Rodriguez nearly screamed. Scarecrow turned his head with movements that seemed mechanical and whispered a single word. "Don't." Rodriguez crawled back, shaking. "LT, that dude is not human. He was awake the whole time. He was watching me crawl toward him, and he let me get within touching distance before he moved. He's been laying in that pile of leaves for 11 hours, and I swear to God he hasn't blinked." Webb nodded slowly. He was starting to understand. These men had trained themselves to shut down their bodies, to enter some kind of meditative state where they could remain alert while appearing completely inactive. It was a level of discipline that Webb had never encountered, not in SEAL training, not in combat, not anywhere. On the second day, the Viet Cong came, not a small patrol. A reinforced company, maybe 40 to 50 men, moving in tactical formation down the trail with weapons at the ready. They were alert, scanning the jungle, moving with the confidence of soldiers who owned this terrain. The SEALs tensed, fingers moving to triggers, ready to spring the ambush if the order came. This was it. This was what they trained for, a target-rich environment. They could call in gunships, drop artillery, light these bastards up and rack up a massive body count. Scarecrow's hand appeared from the leaf litter, signaling a simple message. "Do nothing. Watch only." Webb wanted to argue. This was an opportunity. 50 enemy combatants practically begging to be destroyed. But he trusted Scarecrow enough by now to hold his fire. The SEALs watched, every muscle tense, as the enemy company walked past their position at a distance of less than 30 meters, close enough to see their faces, close enough to hear their conversations, close enough to throw a grenade into their formation. But they did nothing. They watched, and the Australians recorded everything. Scarecrow had somehow produced a tiny camera and was photographing individual soldiers. Dingo was sketching the unit's formation and equipment in a waterproof notepad. Another Australian, hidden in the hollow log, was counting them and noting rank insignia. They weren't hunting these men. They were studying them like scientists observing animals in the wild. The enemy company passed. The jungle returned to its normal rhythm, and Scarecrow signaled to continue observing. Webb was confused, frustrated, and impressed all at the same time. The Australians had just let a company-sized enemy force walk away unmolested. In SEAL doctrine, that was a failure. You find the enemy, you kill the enemy. That's the job. But 6 hours later, Webb understood why Scarecrow had held fire. Another enemy element appeared on the trail. This one was smaller, only 8 men, but they were carrying heavy loads, supply porters. And behind them, walking with the arrogance of authority, was an NVA officer in a clean uniform with rank insignia visible even at distance. A high-value target. The officer was accompanied by 2 bodyguards carrying AK-47s and scanning the jungle with professional wariness. Scarecrow signaled, "This one. This is the one we take." Webb watched as the Australians slowly, incrementally, shifted their positions to create perfect firing angles. There was no rush, no urgency. They had all the time in the world, because the enemy had no idea they were there. The officer walked closer, now 20 meters from the concealed positions, completely unaware that he was about to die. Scarecrow fired. 1 shot. The L1A1 barked once, the heavy 7.62 millimeter round catching the officer in the chest and dropping him like a puppet with cut strings. The two bodyguards spun toward the sound, weapons coming up, mouths opening to shout. Dingo fired twice. Both bodyguards dropped. The supply porters froze for a single heartbeat, then scattered in panic, abandoning their loads and running in 8 different directions. 3 seconds, 3 dead, surgical, perfect. And then the Australians did something that made Webb's blood run cold. They didn't pursue the fleeing porters. They didn't call in the kill to headquarters. They didn't set up security or begin searching the bodies for intelligence. Instead, Scarecrow stood up, walked calmly to the officer's corpse and began arranging it. He positioned the body sitting upright against a tree, placed the officer's hat back on his head at a jaunty angle, and crossed the man's arms over his chest as if he were napping. Then he pulled an ace of spades playing card from his pocket and tucked it into the officer's collar. He did the same with the two bodyguards, creating a grotesque tableau of death that looked almost peaceful, almost respectful, but it was theater, psychological warfare, a message written in corpses. Webb felt his stomach turn. This wasn't combat, this was something else, something colder. The SEALs killed efficiently, professionally, but they didn't stage the dead. They didn't turn bodies into art projects designed to terrify the enemy. This was a violation of something Webb couldn't quite articulate, not the rules of war. The bodies weren't mutilated. But it felt wrong in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. Scarecrow returned to his position in the leaf litter and disappeared again. The patrol continued observing as if nothing had happened. 2 hours later, a recovery team of Viet Cong soldiers arrived, moving cautiously, weapons at the ready. They found the 3 bodies arranged in that unnatural pose, and Webb watched through his binoculars as the psychological warfare tactic did its work. The enemy soldiers stopped, stared. One of them vomited. Another began shouting, his voice high with fear, gesturing wildly at the playing cards. They collected the bodies quickly, frantically, looking over their shoulders at the jungle as if expecting ghosts to materialize. They didn't search the area. They didn't attempt to track the attackers. They grabbed their dead and ran. Scarecrow allowed himself a small smile. Mission accomplished. Not just 3 enemy killed. 3 enemy killed in a way that would spread fear through every unit in the province. Those survivors would tell the story. The bodies sitting upright. The playing cards. The supernatural silence of the attack. The Viet Cong would start to believe the Australian reputation. They would start to fear the jungle itself. And fear was a force multiplier more powerful than any artillery barrage. The patrol extracted at dusk on the 3rd day, moving back to the boats with the same agonizing slowness as the insertion. The SEALs were exhausted, mentally more than physically. They had been tense for 72 hours straight, unable to relax, unable to truly rest. The Australians looked exactly the same as when they'd started, rested, alert, ready to do it all over again. On the boat ride back to base, Webb sat next to Scarecrow and finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. Why the cards? Why arrange them like that? Why not just kill them and move on? Scarecrow looked at the dark water sliding past the boat. Because killing them removes 3 soldiers from the war for 1 day. Terrifying them removes 300 soldiers from the war for a month. Fear is contagious. It spreads. It mutates. By tomorrow, the story will be that we killed 20 men. By next week, it'll be 50. By next month, every Viet Cong in the province will believe we can see in the dark, walk through walls, and kill without being seen. And they'll be half right. He turned to look at Webb with those eyes that had seen things Webb was only beginning to understand. We don't have B-52s. We don't have artillery. We don't have 500,000 soldiers. We have patience, skill, and the willingness to become the thing they fear most. So that's what we do. Webb nodded slowly. He understood now why 28 of his fellow SEALs would request reassignment after this operation. It wasn't fear of the enemy. It was the realization that to fight this war the way the Australians fought, it required becoming something most Americans weren't psychologically prepared to become. You had to embrace the darkness. You had to become comfortable with the theater of death. You had to shed the last remnants of conventional morality and accept that in the jungle there were no rules, only survival. But the real education was just beginning, because 3 weeks later, Webb would participate in a joint training exercise that would shake his understanding of special operations to its core. An exercise that would become known in classified circles as the demonstration. An exercise where the Australians would prove that everything the SEALs thought they knew about close-quarters combat, underwater operations, and aggressive violence of action was merely scratching the surface of what was possible. The invitation came from Captain Michael Thornton, SEAL Team 2 commander, who had become increasingly interested in Australian methods after reading the flood of after-action reports coming back from joint operations. Thornton was a pragmatist. He didn't care about egos or national pride. He cared about results. And the Australians were getting results that made American special operations look pedestrian by comparison. He wanted to know why. More importantly, he wanted to know if SEALs could learn to do the same. The proposal was simple: a 5-day joint training evolution at a classified location in the Philippines. SEALs would demonstrate their maritime assault techniques, underwater demolition, and direct-action raids. The Australians would demonstrate their jungle warfare, tracking, and reconnaissance methods. Both sides would learn from each other, integrate the best techniques, and emerge as better operators. It sounded reasonable, professional, educational. What actually happened would result in the training being terminated after 3 days, 2 SEAL officers requesting psychiatric evaluation, and a classified memo being sent to command stating Australian training methods produce results, but at psychological cost that may not be acceptable for American personnel. The exercise began on a Monday morning with standard SEAL demonstrations. Webb's platoon conducted a beach assault using rigid-hull inflatable boats, breaching a mock enemy position with explosive charges, and clearing a structure with the speed and precision that had made SEALs legendary. It was textbook, beautiful to watch. The Australians observed quietly, taking notes, asking occasional questions about timing and equipment. They seemed impressed but not awed. Then it was their turn. Scarecrow's team was given the same objective: beach landing, breach the position, clear the structure. The SEALs expected to see similar tactics, perhaps with some variation in technique. What they saw instead was something that seemed to violate the laws of physics and human capability. The Australians didn't use boats. They entered the water 3 kilometers offshore at night, with no surface support. They swam the entire distance underwater using a technique they called combat swimming, a method of breath control and minimal movement that allowed them to cover vast distances without surfacing. The SEALs watching from the observation post lost sight of them within minutes and assumed they had surfaced beyond the range of night vision. 3 hours later, the Australians emerged from the surf directly in front of the target building, having navigated 3 kilometers of open ocean in complete darkness without GPS, without surface breaks, without any visible navigation aids. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was what happened next. Instead of immediately assaulting the building, the Australians lay in the surf zone for 45 minutes. Completely still, letting the waves wash over them, becoming part of the beach. The SEAL observers watched through thermal imaging, waiting for them to move, wondering what the hell they were doing. One SEAL instructor muttered, "They're gonna miss the time hack. They're wasting time." Then, just before the designated assault time, the Australians rose from the water like something from a horror movie. Their movements were synchronized, mechanical, inhuman. They moved across the beach without appearing to hurry, but they covered the distance in half the time the SEALs had. There was no explosive breach. Dingo produced a set of lock picks and opened the door in less than 30 seconds, making no sound beyond a faint metallic click. The team flowed into the building like smoke, and the sound of suppressed weapons firing was barely audible even with the observation post less than 100 meters away. 12 seconds after entry, Scarecrow's voice came over the radio. Building clear, 4 enemy neutralized, 0 friendly casualties, no explosive breach required. Structure intact for intelligence exploitation. The SEALs stared at each other in disbelief. Same objective. Half the time, no breaching charges, no noise, no warning to the enemy. It was a ghost operation, and it made the SEAL assault look like a marching band announcement by comparison. Captain Thornton walked down to the beach to congratulate Scarecrow and ask about the technique. That combat swimming. How long can you maintain that without surfacing? Scarecrow shrugged. Depends on water temperature and mission requirements. Longest I've done is 7 kilometers. Took about 5 hours. You learn to slow your heart rate, minimize oxygen consumption, become part of the water. It's uncomfortable but effective. Thornton blinked. 7 kilometers underwater. 5 hours. Without scuba gear, without surface brakes, it seemed impossible. Scarecrow saw the disbelief on his face. It's not magic, Captain, it's just training. We do a lot of pool work, breath control, stress inoculation. You learn that panic is the enemy, not the water. Once you accept that drowning is always an option and you become comfortable with that idea, the fear goes away. Then it's just mechanics. One of the SEAL instructors, a veteran with 3 combat deployments, spoke up. You're telling me you're comfortable with drowning? Scarecrow looked at him with those flat, emotionless eyes. I'm comfortable with dying. Drowning's just one option on the menu. Once you make peace with all of them, you stop being afraid. Fear makes you surface. Fear makes you breathe. Fear makes you visible. We can't afford fear. So we train it out. The SEAL instructor had no response to that. How do you train someone to be comfortable with dying? That wasn't in the curriculum. That wasn't something you could teach in a classroom or a pool. That was a fundamental psychological shift that required breaking down a person's survival instinct and rebuilding them into something else. The second day of the exercise was when things went from impressive to deeply disturbing. The scenario was close quarters combat in confined spaces, specifically tunnel clearance. The training facility had a mock-up of the Ku Kai tunnel system, a claustrophobic nightmare of narrow passages, blind corners, and dead end, designed to simulate the underground networks the Viet Cong used throughout South Vietnam. American forces had struggled with these tunnels for years, sending in volunteers called tunnel rats, small-statured soldiers armed only with pistols and flashlights, crawling through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. It was terrifying, dangerous work with a casualty rate that made even experienced soldiers refuse the assignment. The SEALs demonstrated their tunnel clearance technique first. 2-man teams, one with a flashlight and pistol, the other providing rear security. They moved slowly, methodically, clearing each section before advancing. It took them 45 minutes to clear a tunnel system that was only 60 meters long. They did it professionally, safely, by the book. The Australians watched without comment. Then Scarecrow's team entered the same tunnel system, but they didn't bring flashlights. They didn't bring pistols. They brought knives and absolute darkness. Dingo explained the philosophy before they descended. Light makes you a target. In the tunnels, the Viet Cong know every inch. They can navigate in complete darkness. If you bring a light, you're announcing your position and blinding yourself to everything outside the beam. You become prey, so we don't use light. We use touch, sound, and smell. The SEAL observers looked at each other in disbelief. Navigate a hostile tunnel system in complete darkness. That wasn't training. That was suicide. Captain Thornton started to object, to suggest this was too dangerous for a training exercise, but Scarecrow's team had already descended into the tunnels. The entry hatch closed. Darkness swallowed them. For 18 minutes there was no sound from the tunnels, no radio communication, no movement visible on the monitoring equipment. The SEALs watching the timer started to get nervous. Thornton was about to call the exercise and send in a rescue team when the exit hatch opened and the 4 Australians emerged. They were covered in dirt, breathing heavily but otherwise unaffected. Scarecrow keyed his radio. Tunnel system clear. All enemy positions neutralized. Time 18 minutes. Thornton couldn't believe it. How? How did you navigate that in complete darkness in less than half the time it took us with lights? Scarecrow pulled off his gloves and Webb saw that his hands were raw, bleeding from dozens of small cuts. You feel the walls. You map the space in your mind. You listen to how sound echoes. You smell the airflow to know which passages lead to exits. And you move slowly enough that you don't make noise but fast enough that the enemy doesn't have time to prepare. It's not comfortable. It's not safe. But it works. Dingo added, in the real tunnels we found the enemy by smell. They eat fish sauce and rice. It has a distinct odor. You can smell them breathing if you're close enough. Sometimes you can hear their heartbeat in the silence. When you find them, you don't announce yourself. You just move on them and finish it before they know you're there. No shots, no lights. Just darkness and steel. One of the younger SEALs, a kid fresh out of training who still believed in the invincibility of American special operations, spoke up with a trembling voice. That's not soldiering, that's not even human. You're talking about crawling through pitch-black tunnels and killing people with knives in the dark. That's psychopath shit. The room went silent. Scarecrow turned to look at the young SEAL, and for the first time since Webb had met him, there was emotion in his eyes. Not anger, something sadder, something that looked like pity. You're right. It's not human, that's the point. In the tunnels, humanity gets you killed. Hesitation gets you killed. Light gets you killed. Sound gets you killed. So you become something that doesn't hesitate, doesn't need light, doesn't make sound. You become the thing that lives in the dark. And when the war is over, if you're lucky, you become human again. Most of us aren't that lucky. He walked out of the briefing room, leaving the SEALs in stunned silence. Webb followed him outside and found Scarecrow sitting on the steps, smoking a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. It was the first sign of weakness Webb had ever seen from the man. Scarecrow, what he said in there, he didn't mean anything by it. He's young, he doesn't understand. Scarecrow took a long drag and exhaled slowly. He's right, though. We're not soldiers anymore. We're something else. The Australian Army doesn't talk about it. They don't put it in the recruitment brochures. But the selection process, the training, the operations, it all does the same thing. It takes normal men and breaks them down, then builds them back into predators. And predators don't fit back into civilian society. We tried to warn you Americans. We tried to tell you that our methods work, but they cost something you can't measure in dollars or statistics. They cost your humanity. And once you give that up, you don't get it back. He stubbed out the cigarette and looked at Webb with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient, tired beyond measure. You know what the worst part is? We're good at it. We're so fucking good at being monsters that we forget we used to be anything else. I have dreams where I'm back on my family's sheep station, trying to do normal things like fix a fence or help with shearing. And in the dream, I don't remember how. I don't remember what it feels like to do something that isn't hunting or killing or hiding. The jungle is the only place that makes sense anymore. The only place where what we are is useful instead of terrifying. Webb sat down next to him, not knowing what to say. For the first time since this joint operation began, he understood why so many SEALs were requesting reassignment. It wasn't about tactics or techniques. It wasn't about national pride or ego. It was about seeing the logical endpoint of what they were becoming and being horrified by it. The Australians were further down that road. They were what SEALs would become if they followed the Australian methods to their ultimate conclusion, effective beyond measure, but at a cost that couldn't be calculated. The third day was when the exercise fell apart completely. The scenario was a live-fire hostage rescue. The facility had a mock village with role players acting as hostages and enemy combatants. The SEALs would demonstrate their hostage rescue technique, then the Australians would do the same. Standard special operations training. Everyone had done it 100 times. The SEALs executed flawlessly, breached the building, neutralized the enemy role players with simulated kills, secured the hostages, and extracted in under 3 minutes. Textbook. Perfect. The Australians would have to work hard to match that performance, but the Australians didn't match it. They exceeded it in a way that made everyone watching deeply uncomfortable. They approached the scenario from a completely different angle. Instead of immediate assault, they observed the building for 2 hours. They mapped the enemy positions, counted the guards, noted their patrol patterns, and identified the exact room where the hostages were being held. Then, instead of a coordinated breach, they sent one man, just one. Dingo entered the building through a window on the second floor that had been left open, because the role players didn't think anyone could reach it without a ladder. Dingo free-climbed the exterior wall, using fingertips and edges that seemed impossibly small. Once inside, he moved through the building like smoke, and the SEAL observers watching on camera couldn't believe what they were seeing. He passed within inches of enemy role players who never saw him. He moved so slowly that the human eye couldn't detect the motion. It took him 40 minutes to reach the hostage room, a journey of maybe 30 meters. When he reached the hostages, he didn't immediately extract them. He waited for the guard patrol to establish a pattern. Then, when the moment was perfect, he eliminated 2 guards with a simulated knife kill so realistic that both role players later said they genuinely feared for their lives. He secured the hostages, moved them to the extraction point, and signaled for the rest of his team to create a diversion on the opposite side of the building. While the enemy role players responded to the noise, Dingo walked the hostages out the front door. Total time from insertion to extraction, 53 minutes. Enemy casualties, 2. Hostages rescued, all of them. Noise generated, almost none. It was perfect. It was also completely insane by American doctrine standards. Captain Thornton called a halt to the exercise immediately. He gathered both teams in the briefing room, and his face was red with barely controlled anger. What the hell was that? You sent one man into a building with 8 enemy combatants and 2 hostages. One man, that's not tactics, that's Russian roulette. If anything had gone wrong, if one guard had looked the wrong direction, if one floorboard had creaked, he would have been dead and the hostages would have been executed. You got lucky. That's all. Scarecrow stood up slowly. Captain, with respect, it wasn't luck. It was calculation. We observed for 2 hours. We knew every guard position, every patrol route, every sight line. We knew the floor plans because Dingo memorized them during the brief. We knew which boards creaked because we listened to the guards walking for 90 minutes. There was no luck involved. Only patience and preparation. Thornton slammed his hand on the table. You're missing the point. American doctrine requires redundancy, backup plans, overwhelming force to ensure mission success. You're operating on a razor's edge with no margin for error. That's not professional, that's reckless. It's efficient, Scarecrow replied, his voice still calm. Your method works. Ours works better. You rescued the hostages in 3 minutes with 6 men and a lot of noise. We rescued them in 53 minutes with 1 man and no noise. In a real scenario, your method alerts every enemy in a kilometer radius that you're there. Reinforcements arrive. The area becomes hot. Extraction becomes a gunfight. Our method leaves the enemy confused, disorganized, still looking for threats that already disappeared. Both methods get the hostages out. Only one method lets you do it again tomorrow. Webb watched this exchange with growing unease. Both men were right. Both methods worked, but they represented fundamentally incompatible philosophies. The American way was about overwhelming force, backup plans, acceptable risk managed through firepower and numbers. The Australian way was about perfect execution, zero margin for error, unacceptable risk managed through skill and patience. You couldn't mix them. You had to choose. That night, after the official training was suspended pending review, Webb found himself unable to sleep. He walked out to the beach and found Dingo sitting on the sand, staring at the ocean. Webb sat down next to him. "Can I ask you something? That hostage rescue, you weren't scared, not even a little bit. You were completely alone in that building. If anything had gone wrong, you would have died alone." Dingo picked up a handful of sand and let it run through his fingers. "I'm scared every single time. Terrified, actually. But fear is just information. It tells you the stakes are high. It doesn't tell you what to do. Training tells you what to do. So you acknowledge the fear, file it away, and execute the mission. The fear is still there, but it's not in control. Does that make sense?" Webb nodded. "Yeah, it does, but here's what I don't understand. Why do you do it? Why accept missions that are so dangerous, so difficult, when there are easier ways to accomplish the same objective? Why choose the hardest path every single time?" Dingo smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Because we're a small country with a small army. We can't afford to fight fair. We can't outgun anyone. We can't outnumber anyone. So we have to outthink them and outtrain them. We have to be so good that one of us is worth 10 of them. It's not about being brave or being crazy. It's about survival. Australia doesn't have the luxury of acceptable casualties. Every man we lose is someone's brother, someone's son, someone's father from a country of only 12 million people. So we train harder. We accept harder missions. We become better because the alternative is unacceptable." He stood up, brushed the sand off his pants, and looked down at Webb. "Your SEALs are good, really good. But you're good because America has the resources to make you good. We're good because we have to be. That's the difference. You choose to be elite. We have no choice. And that desperation makes us sharper, hungrier, willing to go places you won't go because you don't have to." The joint training exercise was officially terminated the next morning. The official reason given was scheduling conflicts. The real reason, recorded in classified after-action reports that wouldn't be declassified for 40 years, was that Australian training methods were deemed psychologically damaging to American personnel and incompatible with U.S. military culture. 28 SEALs who participated in the exercise requested reassignment to other units. 2. Required psychiatric evaluation after experiencing nightmares about tunnel operations. 1 SEAL, Rodriguez from Webb's original patrol, broke down during a debriefing and stated, "I can't stop thinking about what Scarecrow said, about becoming something that isn't human. I see it happening to me. Every operation I feel a little less, I laugh a little less, I care a little less. I don't want to end up like them. I don't want to be good at this if it means losing myself." But 19 SEALs had the opposite reaction. 19 men, including Lieutenant Marcus Webb, submitted requests for extended cross-training with Australian SAS units. They wanted to learn more. They wanted to become better. They were willing to accept the cost. The Navy denied every single request, citing concerns about operational integration and doctrinal compatibility. The real reason, unstated but understood, was that the Navy didn't want their SEALs coming back changed. They didn't want men who had learned to operate in complete darkness, who had embraced the psychological transformation required to become perfect predators. They wanted warriors, not weapons. Webb received his denial letter and read it in silence. Then he wrote his own letter, addressed to NAVSPECWAR Command, that would become one of the most widely circulated classified documents in special operations history. The letter read, "Sir, I have operated with the best of the best. I have served with men I would trust with my life. But after 3 weeks with the Australian SAS, I have been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. We are not the best. We are the most well-funded. We have the best equipment, the most support, the largest budgets. But in terms of pure operational effectiveness, in terms of results achieved per man deployed, the Australians exceed us by an order of magnitude. This is not a criticism of SEAL training or capability. This is a recognition that there are levels to special operations that we have not yet reached. Levels that require sacrifices we may not be willing to make. I requested cross-training not because I think SEALs are inadequate, but because I believe we can learn from operators who have mastered aspects of warfare that we barely understand. I respect your decision to deny my request, but I also respectfully submit that if we refuse to learn from the best because their methods make us uncomfortable, we are choosing pride over effectiveness. And in war, pride gets men killed. The letter was classified secret and filed. No official response was ever issued. But over the following years, elements of Australian training methodology quietly began appearing in SEAL curriculum, not the psychological aspects, not the extreme isolation or the comfort with mortality, but the technical skills, the combat swimming techniques, the tracking methods, the patience and observation training. The lessons were integrated piecemeal, sanitized, made palatable for American consumption. Scarecrow's unit returned to Vietnam and continued operations. They would complete their tour with the same impossible statistics that had defined their deployment. Over 500 enemy killed, 3 Australian casualties. Entire provinces abandoned by the Viet Cong simply because the Australians operated there. They became legends, ghosts, the Ma-R-Letter 1EBNG that enemy soldiers feared more than American bombers. Lieutenant Webb completed his tour and returned to the United States. He would go on to have a distinguished career in naval special warfare, eventually retiring as a captain after 25 years of service. But he never forgot those 3 weeks with the Australians. He never forgot the lesson that being elite isn't about equipment or funding or national pride. It's about the willingness to become whatever the mission requires, to pay whatever cost is necessary, to go to places others won't go because the alternative is failure. Decades later, when researchers interviewed Webb for an oral history project on Vietnam-era special operations, he was asked what he remembered most about working with the Australian SAS. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost reverential. "We thought they were joking when they said they'd been in position for 6 days without moving. Then we saw the evidence, the discipline, the dedication, the absolute commitment to mission success regardless of personal cost, and we realized we weren't looking at soldiers. We were looking at what soldiers become when there's no other choice but to be perfect. The Australians taught us that there are no shortcuts to excellence, no equipment that replaces skill, no doctrine that substitutes for will. They showed us the ceiling, and most of us realized we'd never reach it because we weren't willing to pay the price they paid, not because we couldn't. Because we chose not to, and that's okay. That's human, but they stopped being human a long time ago. They became something else, something necessary, something terrifying, and something I'll respect for the rest of my life. The interviewer asked if he would have made different choices if he could do it again. Webb smiled, but like Dingo's smile all those years ago on the beach in the Philippines, it didn't reach his eyes. I don't know. Part of me wishes I'd been allowed to train with them longer, to learn everything they knew, to become that good. But another part of me is grateful I didn't, because I got to come home and be a husband, a father, a normal person. The Australians I knew, most of them never managed that. They were too good at war to ever really leave it. Scarecrow wrote me a letter once, about 10 years after Vietnam. He was working security in some corporate job, and he said he felt like an alien pretending to be human, going through the motions of normal life but never quite fitting. He said the jungle was the only place he ever made sense, and that's the price. That's what you give up when you become that good. You become so effective at one thing that you lose the ability to be anything else. So no, I don't regret not going further down that path. I got to stay human. They didn't. And both choices were valid. Both were necessary. We just served different purposes in the same war. The Australian SAS methods were never fully adopted by American special operations, but they were studied, respected, and quietly integrated where possible. The lessons about patience, about fieldcraft, about the power of psychological warfare, about becoming part of the environment rather than fighting against it. These lessons filtered through the special operations community and changed how America approached unconventional warfare. Today, when Navy SEALs train for long-range reconnaissance, when they practice combat swimming, when they learn tracking and observation techniques, they're learning from a curriculum that was influenced by those 3 weeks in 1969, when the best maritime commandos in the world met a group of Australians and realized there were depths to special operations they had never imagined. The Australians proved that small numbers of perfectly trained operators could achieve what large forces could not. They proved that patience and skill could defeat technology and firepower. They proved that psychological warfare was as important as physical combat, and they proved that there is always a cost, always a price. The question isn't whether you can become that good. The question is whether you're willing to pay what it costs. The SEALs learned that lesson in the jungles of Vietnam, in the tunnels of Khu Kai, and on the beaches of the Philippines. They learned it from men who had already paid the price and couldn't go back. They thought they were joking. They weren't. They were showing the SEALs the future. A future where perfection in combat means sacrifice in life, where becoming the ultimate warrior means losing part of yourself you'll never get back, where excellence comes at a cost that can't be measured in dollars or medals or commendations. And that lesson, uncomfortable and difficult as it was, made American special operations better. Not by making them more like the Australians, but by showing them that there were levels they hadn't reached, standards they hadn't met, sacrifices they hadn't made. And that knowledge, that uncomfortable truth, drove them to improve, to adapt, to become better without becoming something they couldn't live with. The ghosts of the jungle taught the warriors of the sea, and both were changed forever.